We are now live, and it is such a pleasure to be here for this session on labor market institutions and outcomes. So during the session, we are going to be hearing 4 different papers that are looking at a wide variety of features of the labor market. So we're looking from retirement patterns and job referral networks to parental leave and sick leave, and we're connecting these features to key worker level outcomes, earnings, availability of benefits, and job mobility. So to give you a preview of what's coming next, we're first going to hear from Paul Monin, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan, and his presentation is titled "The Impact of the Retirement Slowdown on the U.S. Labor Market." Then we'll turn to Matt Stager, who is a PhD candidate of the University of Maryland and our very own dissertation scholar at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. His paper is titled "The Intergenerational Transmission of Employers and Earnings of Young Workers." Both of those papers are going to be discussed by the fabulous Emily Wiemers, who is an associate professor at Syracuse University. And then we'll turn over to the next set of 2 papers, one by Lynn Toe, assistant professor at Boston University, who will be presenting on the signaling role of parental leave, and then on to Nicholas Zebarth, associate professor at Cornell University, for his presentation on mandated sick pay, coverage, utilization, and welfare effects. And then we'll wrap up with some great comments from Eric Chin, who is an assistant professor at Dartmouth College. This set of papers is tapping into several very live and exciting conversations in the policy world. And given that, I'm really excited to announce that this whole session is going to be on the record. So for journalists and non-journalists alike, we encourage you to tweet, to share, to discuss. On social media, you can join the conversations using the hashtags hashtag EGGrantee and hashtag EG2021. We have a way for you to get the social media handles for participants in this session. So you can go to bit.ly/EG2021_SM. So I think that stands for Equitable Growth 2021_social media. Again, that's bit.ly/EG2021_SM. Another way to get plugged into that conversation is just to go to our handle at Equitable Growth and follow along and see the information for presenters there. This session will conclude at 4:30 Eastern Time, and we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. But throughout the presentations, as questions pop into your head, I highly encourage you to use the Submit Q&A button on your screen. So as you submit your reactions and questions in the chat, we'll tee them up for our question and answer at the end of the session. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul to get us started.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alex. And thanks everyone for joining. It's really a pleasure to be here and talk to you a little bit about my work on the impact of retirements on the US labor market. So can everyone see my screen? I'm assuming so. Okay. So the motivation.
Paul, if you want to make it full screen, we'll see.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So the motivation for this project is set as 3 stylized facts. So the first, and one that maybe a lot of you are familiar with, is that older Americans are working longer and longer. So in this graph, I'm plotting the share of Americans aged 55 or older that are employed since 1980. And what you can see is that since the mid-1990s, there's been a tremendous increase in the 55+ employment rate, from around 30% to 40%. Now, given that older Americans make about 30% of the US population currently, that's a massive shock. Now, the second fact, which is somewhat less well known, is that older workers are increasingly concentrated in high-skilled jobs, such as professional and managerial occupations. So here, what I've done in this graph is decompose the 55+ employment rate into the component that comes from high-skilled jobs in blue, middle-skilled jobs in green, and low-skilled jobs in red. And as you can see, older workers are increasingly concentrated at the top of the job ladder. Now, a key factor behind this trend has been the steady rise in the educational attainment of older generations. So the share of older Americans with a college degree has roughly tripled since 1980. Now, at the other end of the labor market, younger workers haven't fared that well. So they're increasingly starting their career at lower rungs of the job ladder. So in this graph, I'm plotting changes in employment shares between 1990 and 2017 in low-skilled jobs, middle-skilled jobs, and high-skilled jobs separately for those without a college degree in red and those with a college degree or more in blue. And so we can see is that younger workers are less likely to start their career in high-skilled jobs today than in 1990, and more likely to start their career in low-skilled jobs, particularly those without a college degree. Now, the trends for non-college educated, I think there are a lot of explanations out there. For example, routinization, automation, import competition. So it's not too hard to come up with explanations why they're not doing as well today as in the past. But it's harder to come up with explanations for why college graduates, why their prospects have stagnated over time. And so in this paper, motivated by these facts, I'm interested in exploring whether and how the skill bias retirement slowdown has affected youth labor market outcomes in recent decades. So why should we care about this? For two reasons. One is we know that poor initial job prospects can have long-term consequences. So think of the literature on the long-term scars of graduating during a recession, for example. Second, from a policy perspective, a lot of countries are currently encouraging people to work even longer, for example, by raising the retirement age. And so it's important to understand the impact of greater labor supply at older ages. So to answer this question, I'm going to draw on publicly available census data from 1980 to 2017. And essentially what I'm going to do is compare the evolution of youth employment outcomes across US commuting zones that have experienced differential retirements over the period 1980 to 2017. And to be more specific, I'm basically going to regress 10-year changes in average youth employment outcomes across commuting zones on retirements over 10 years, controlling for period fixed effects and start of period commuting zone controls for 4 periods. Now, empirically, the challenge is that retirements tend to be correlated with the state of local economy. So what you'll tend to find is that in places where the local economy is booming, fewer workers are retiring and youth employment outcomes are improving. So another way to say this is that a rising tide lifts all ships. Now, to break this mechanical correlation, what I'm going to do is use an instrumental variable strategy which exploits cross-commuting zone differences in the initial age composition among the old to isolate the labor supply side component of retirements. And so the idea is that because older Americans tend to retire at predictable ages, typically in their 60s, it's possible to predict how many people are going to retire in a certain area simply based on the initial age structure. So to support the validity of this strategy, I show in the paper that a lot of the variation in age composition can be traced back to historical birth patterns. Now, just to formalize this a little bit more here, what I'm plotting are 10-year retirement rates by age for the age on the x-axis for the period 1980 to 1990. And so, for example, how I define this is this dot is going to be the employment rate of 60-year-olds in 1980 nationally minus the employment rate of 70-year-olds in 1990, so the same cohort. And so this dot says that 40% of 60-year-olds in 1980 retired at some point between 1980 and 1990. And so the main takeaway from this picture is that you have this bell shape, which peaks for people in their late 60s. Why? Because people tend to retire in their 60s. And so these people over the next 10 years are going to go through peak retirement ages. Now, in contrast, people in their late 40s will not reach their peak retirement age yet over the next 10 years, whereas people in their late 60s and onwards have already retired for the most part. And so what this figure shows is that you can exploit cross-commuting zone differences in 45 plus age composition to kind of predict how many people are going to retire in a certain area. Okay, so what do I find? So in these graphs, what I'm going to plot are IV estimates for a 1 percentage point decline in retirements as a share of the total population on 10-year changes in average youth employment outcomes. So in this graph, I'm looking at youth employment, unemployment, and non-labor force participation. And what you can see is that fewer retirements doesn't have much of an effect on the employment of non-college graduates, but it has a significant negative effect on the employment of college graduates. Now, the main finding of the paper is that fewer retirements has a negative impact on youth occupational composition. So here, what you can see is that in places where fewer older workers are retiring, the share of younger workers that are employed in high-skilled jobs goes down, particularly among college graduates, while the share of younger workers in low-skilled jobs goes up, particularly among non-college graduates. Now, correspondingly with this finding, I also documented in the paper that in places where fewer older workers retire, there's a rise in the share of overeducated younger workers. So think of that as college graduates working in non-college jobs, or people with an associate's degree working in a job that only requires a high school degree or less. Now, the finding that fewer retirements have a negative impact on the employment of college graduates and a negative impact on the share of younger workers in high-skilled jobs really highlights the skill biasness of retirement trends in the US. Now, I just want to go over 3 additional findings in the paper. The first is that in places where there are fewer retirements, I showed that the average job mobility rate among young workers goes down. And so this makes a lot of sense because when someone retires, that tends to trigger a vacancy chain. So there's gonna be replacement hire all along the job ladder. And so fewer retirements at the top, so a slower trickle of people out of the labor force, means less movement all along the ladder. And second, young adults adjust to worse labor market prospects in 2 ways. One is they tend to stay in school longer or go back to school. And the second is that the youth population tends to contract in places where fewer older workers are retiring. So there's either less in-migration or more out-migration out of those places among young workers. And so these 2 findings are consistent with previous literature, which highlights, in different contexts, which highlights that both schooling choices and location choices respond to the state of the local economy, particularly among college graduates when it comes to location choices.
2 minutes.
Yeah. So to conclude, there are 2 main takeaways from my paper. The first is that it provides a new explanation for stagnant early career outcomes in the US, particularly among college graduates. Now, at the beginning, one of the early figures, I showed you that young college graduates were slightly less likely to start their career in high-skilled jobs, about 2 percentage points. And a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation shows that the slowdown in retirements can explain about 70% of this decline. And second, policies such as raising the retirement age, which are basically intended to ease the fiscal burden on younger generations, may actually end up holding them back in the labor market. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Paul. And then we will turn it right over to Matt to go next.
Perfect. Let me just share my screen. All right. Can you hear me okay and see my slides?
Looks perfect.
Perfect. All right. So thank you guys for tuning in. Today I'll be talking about my paper, The Intergenerational Transmission of Employers and the Earnings of Young Workers. And this is a project that uses data from the Census Bureau, so the standard disclaimer applies. So the motivation for this paper begins with the observation that in the United States, earnings are highly persistent from one generation to the next. And this persistence raises concerns about whether our economic system is both equitable and efficient. But the design and justification of a policy response really depends critically on the mechanisms through which parents are shaping the earnings of their children. So research in economics has typically focused on the role of human capital in the sense that papers have typically attributed differences in earnings by family background to differences in things like skills and education. However, another area of research in economics finds the ubiquitous use of social context in the labor market, and also finds that the firm to which a worker matches is a really important determinant of earnings. So in light of this other research, kind of an open question is, to what extent do parents shape the earnings of their children by using connections to provide access to high-paying firms? And so my paper is going to look at one particular way in which parents might do this. And specifically, I investigate how the earnings of young workers are affected by individuals going and working for the same employer as their parent. And I refer to this tendency as the intergenerational transmission of employers. So the basic idea here is that the intergenerational transmission of employers will amplify the intergenerational persistence in earnings if the average benefits are increasing in parental earnings. So in other words, if individuals from high income backgrounds or with high income parents tend to be the largest beneficiaries of working for a parent's employer. And it turns out that the average benefits can just be written as the proportion of individuals who work for a parent's employer times the earnings consequences of working for a parent's employer. And so the goal of the paper is to understand how these two things vary across the parental earnings distribution. And just to give you a quick preview of the results, I find that individuals with higher earning parents are both more likely to work for the employer of a parent, and they benefit more conditional on doing so. And thus the intergenerational transmission of employers increases the intergenerational persistence in earnings by about 10%. So before jumping into the results, let me give you a brief overview of the data that I used to tackle this question. So I used linked survey and administrative data. More specifically, I linked survey data from the 2000 decennial census, which allows me to measure the relationships between parents and children who are living together in 2000, with administrative data from the LEHD program, which allows me to measure individual earnings and employer characteristics for both parents and children between 2000 and 2016. So my analysis is going to focus on about a sample of about 17 million individuals who were born between 1982 and 1992. And throughout the presentation, there's kind of three key definitions to keep in mind. So the first is I use the term employer to refer to the activity of a firm within a state and industry. Parental earnings refers to a measure of lifetime parental earnings measured between the ages 35 and 55. And all of the results I'm about to show you are applied to the first job of the individual, which is the first job that meets certain earnings restrictions. And so the key takeaway from this definition of first job is that I'm excluding things like internships or summer jobs, and rather I'm focusing on kind of the first real job that marks the beginning of one's career. So this figure presents the first main result, which shows the proportion of individuals who work for the same employer as a parent at their first job. Overall, I find that 7% of individuals work for the same employer as a parent at their first job, and 29% will do so at some point between the ages of 18 and 30. So this is kind of a surprisingly common phenomenon. These two figures break out the statistics relative to for the first job, broken out by sex, so daughters on the left panel, sons on the right, parental earnings, which is depicted on the x-axis, and then categories of race and ethnicity, which are depicted by these separate lines. And kind of one important takeaway from these figures is that in general, individuals with higher earning parents on the right side of the figure tend to be more likely to work for the same employers as a parent relative to those at the bottom end of the parental earnings distribution. And so, there's a couple of explanations for why someone might end up at the same employer as a parent. In the paper, I present a number of pieces of evidence that point to a story of labor market networks whereby parents are somehow influencing the hiring or job search process in order to help their children who otherwise would have struggled to find decent paying jobs. So in the second section of the paper, I then move on and try to understand what the earnings consequences are of working for a parent's employer. The key empirical challenge here is that individuals who work for a parent's employer may be fundamentally different from those who do not. And so to address that concern, I use an instrumental variable strategy that exploits exogenous variation in the availability of jobs at the parent's employer. So specifically what I do is I estimate a regression where the outcome variable is the log earnings at the first job. And I instrument for whether an individual works for the same employer as a parent using the hiring rate at the parent's employer. And my empirical specification includes two-way fixed effects for the parent's employer as well as the local labor market. And so intuitively what this empirical strategy is doing is I'm comparing two individuals whose parents work for the exact same employer, but who enter the labor market in different periods. And the idea is that the individual who enters the labor market when there's more hiring going on at the parent's employer, they're more likely to receive a job offer from their parent's employer. And kind of the key assumption in this setup is that after controlling for local labor market conditions, the difference in earnings between these two individuals is driven by the difference in the propensity for them to work at their parent's employer. And so using this, I can then back out the causal effect of working for working for a parent's employer on earnings. So this table presents the main results. Column 5 presents the results on individual earnings, and those estimates suggest that working for the same employer as a parent increases initial earnings at the first job by 31%. So this is a very large effect on earnings, and it should immediately make you wonder, what's driving the effects here. So one plausible story is that parents are using their connections to provide access to high-paying firms. And so I investigate this in column 4, where I estimate an employer-specific pay premium. So for those of you familiar with this literature, this is the AKM empirical model I use to estimate these employer pay premiums. And what the estimates in this column suggest are that by working for the same employer as a parent, individuals end up working at firms that pay 30% more to all workers. And what's remarkable is that the estimates on the employer-specific pay premiums are almost identical to the estimates on individual earnings. So this provides really compelling evidence that the earnings benefits are driven by parents providing access to high-paying firms. So there's a wide class of models that illustrate how imperfect competition in the labor market produces job ladders, whereby more productive firms poach workers from less productive firms by offering higher wages. And consistent with those models, I find that individuals who work for the same employer as a parent end up working at firms that are more productive, that's column 1, that tend to poach workers from other firms, that's column 2, and that tend to pay all workers more, that's column 3. And so intuitively, by taking a job at their parent's employer, individuals are able to start their careers on a higher rung of the job ladder.
We're at 2 minutes.
2 minutes, perfect. So one other set of results I'll mention here very briefly are that in general, I find when I estimate separate results by sex and parental earnings, I find that individuals with higher earning parents experience larger earnings benefits from working for a parent's employer, although this variation across the parental earnings distribution appears to be driven by sons. So in the final part of the paper, I then move on and investigate implications for intergenerational mobility. So as I previously mentioned, the average benefit of working for the intergenerational transmission of employers is just equal to the proportion of individuals who work for a parent's employer times the earnings consequences. And so these two figures plot how these earnings benefits vary both by the sex of the child, parental earnings, as well as race and ethnicity. And kind of the key takeaway here is that for both daughters, but particularly for sons, I find that the earnings benefits are increasing in parental earnings. And so it turns out that because of this, the intergenerational transmission of employers increases the degree to which earnings persist across generations by about 10%. So, on the one hand, this is a somewhat modest effect, but I think it's important to keep in mind that parents might have connections at other firms, and thus my results likely understate the importance of parental labor market networks more broadly defined. So just to wrap up, the kind of key point of the paper is that I show that differences in earnings by family background are attributable in part to parents using their connections to provide access to high-paying firms. And I think this result is informative of both the justification and design of policy. So on the justification side, the idea that individuals from high-income backgrounds earn more in part because of the connections of their parents is in some sense unfair to the extent that, and I think most people would agree that it kind of goes against our notions of equality of opportunity. And then from the design side, to the extent that we really want to achieve equality of opportunity, my results suggest that education-focused interventions should be combined with additional support to help young workers from disadvantaged backgrounds navigate their early careers. So examples of this could include mentorship programs or something like a job guarantee. And that's all I have. So thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks so much, Matt. So we're now going to turn it over to Emily for her discussant comments. And before she gets started, I just also want to encourage everyone in the audience to submit your own comments and questions through the question feature. So take it away, Emily.
Sorry. It's like I haven't been doing this for a whole semester here. Okay, here we go. Okay, can you see that okay?
It looks like it didn't go into full screen mode. Do you want to try one more time?
Okay, let's try again. It's on full screen mode in my...
Okay, we can still see, so I think we're probably good.
I'll try one more time, how about? Sorry. How's that?
I think we can still see the border, but we can also see your slide. So I think it's
Thanks.
fine.
Okay, well, we'll live with it how it is. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss both of these papers, which I very much enjoyed. I will say that they're both much longer than their 10-minute presentations suggest and have lots more detail. So some of what I'm going to discuss is in that detail. But I thought I would start by just drawing some connections between these two papers. I think they're really interesting together because they show us, they both look at how the labor supply choices of one generation impacts the labor market outcomes of another generation. Paul's paper looks at this at the level of commuting zone labor markets, and Matt's paper looks at this at the level of a family. And both papers are really interesting in that they focus not just on these interactions, but also on the mechanisms that drive those interactions. And I think they both look at issues that are pretty common in terms of what people talk about. You know, someone's dad gets them a job, or someone can't get a job because someone won't retire, but that we lack empirical examinations of. So I think they're really useful and especially interesting as the sort of two biggest generations in the population are bookending the prime earning years of the labor market. So boomers retiring and millennials at their early job years. So it's a great time for these papers to be here. I'll just start by talking about Paul's paper, which I think the only thing I'll say is that his motivation is really compelling, where he shows this rising employment rates of high-skilled workers since the 1980s, at the same time that there's been stagnation in youth employment outcomes, and in particular, a larger share of young adults in low-skilled occupations. And he uses a Bartik-style instrumental variable strategy to isolate these changes that are due to these demographic factors. My general comments are that the focus on the skill composition of occupations across generations is extremely important and innovative. And while he didn't highlight it here, in the paper he shows that the overall employment effects are actually not, there's none in the aggregate, but that if you then break these into looking at full-time and part-time employment, or looking at the share of employment across skills, that we actually do see that these overall effects, like no effects, hide an awful lot of big changes in the labor market for young adults. The paper also focuses on heterogeneity in these effects across types of workers, which is extremely useful. In the slides, he's focused on educational attainment, but in the paper, he shows differences also by gender, age, and time period. And it's actually on some of these heterogeneous effects that I'm going to focus a little on some suggestions. And I think what he presented on the adjustment margins that young adults may employ in the presence of these labor markets that aren't so great for them is really useful, thinking about increases in college enrollment and out-migration as sort of mechanisms for exiting labor markets that are not particularly fruitful.
Emily, I'm going to interrupt to tell you that we're still seeing slide 2 out of 10. I don't know if you've moved forward.
My goodness. Sorry.
So sorry.
No, it's okay.
We're running a little ahead, so don't worry about,
I don't know. Okay, let me try again. My goodness gracious. Okay, now, can you see now when I move?
Yes, we can see them moving.
So we'll just go with this. Okay, so I'd like to push Paul on two issues. The first is to think more about workers in middle age. So in the paper, what he shows is that there's very small effects of retirement on the employment of middle-aged workers, and that there's smaller effects on occupational structure and wages for middle-aged workers than for younger workers. And there's a little bit of discussion on why the effects are small among middle-aged workers, but I think that's a little bit of a puzzle, why we would think that middle-aged workers are closer substitutes for these retiring older workers, and yet we don't see very many effects there. And I think in order to explain this sort of job ladder strategy, it'd be nice to see some cascading effects across ages, or for some explanation of why they're not there. And that's not just because I am myself a middle-aged worker. The second piece is to think about the effects that you show for women. So in the paper, Paul shows that the results for the changes in the share, the increases in the share of less skilled occupations is actually driven primarily by women. And I want you to sort of at least consider shifts in the demand for caregiving. So increases in retirement are going to increase demand for caring professions. And these tend to be professions that are female dominated and low skill and low wage. So this should increase the wages of care workers. But I think it has an ambiguous effect on the wages of low skilled workers overall. If there's variation in wages across low skilled occupations, and in particular, if these are particularly low paying, low skilled occupations, and you see compositional changes in the low skill occupational composition. So I think there's a discussion about demand shifts in the paper, but I think demand shifts for caregiving may be something to think about in particular when you're thinking about retiring workers who may require care. But I really like this paper, and I can't wait to see it when it's finished. So I'll turn to Matt's paper. I'm excited to see this because I think that I saw like an early thought process of this a couple of years ago at an Equitable Growth Conference. So it's wonderful to see it in its full blown, very long iteration. So the motivation here is thinking through the extent to which the intergenerational transmission of employers affects the declining intergenerational mobility. And he finds pretty large effects, and he shows descriptively that an awful lot of kids work for the same employer as their parent. And he uses this instrumental variable strategy that he described to sort of isolate the variation in the availability of jobs at the parent's employer. So the descriptive evidence here is amazing, and I would like more of it. So this is a figure that Matt didn't show, but which is similar to the one that he did show, which just shows the proportion of kids who are employed in the same firm as their parent across the parent's earnings distribution. And one thing that you just notice is that way up here at the top of the earnings distribution, there's this huge increase in the proportion for both men and women who are employed in the same employer as their parent. And this is driven entirely by either being employed in the same firm as your parent, or the primary earner, or the employer of both parents. And I think that this sort of nonlinearity at the very top is kind of interesting, and one that I think that you could explore descriptively. So the parents at the very top of the earnings distribution you show are very likely to actually be the highest earner in their firm. And the LEHD just has a huge sample. I mean, you have 17 million kids, right? So it'd be interesting to see whether you can say something about these kind of CEO parents who hire their kids, and whether the transmission and earnings effects are different for these parents than for sort of middle managers who help their kid get a job at their firm. And it's, of course, CEO parents could occur across the entire distribution of parental earnings. But I just think, since when the parents are the highest earner, this is, I think, pretty interesting descriptively, and might say something about like the mechanism, like, is it that they're directly hiring their kid, or that their job networks help them get a job?
And we're at 2 minutes, Emily.
Great. So the other two comments are a little bit more just about kind of what's not in the data and what you might want to think about. I think that you don't observe educational attainment of the kids and parents. And so I think the most plausible threat to your identification strategy is that the characteristics of parents and children are related somehow to the time variation in the hiring rates of firms. And I was just sort of thinking of a story where you have a firm that's growing in sort of a multi-year way, and they're looking for highly educated workers, and the kid and the parent both get hired at this employer because of something that's unobservable to you, which is that they're both highly educated. And maybe even educated in a certain field, right? And so it might just be worth thinking through kind of the fact that you're missing education and how that affects what you're able to say about this sort of threat to your identification. And in the same vein, I think when you're comparing effect sizes with things like the union wage premium, it's helpful to think through whether the comparisons are ones where they control for education or not, because you aren't controlling for education in your estimates. And the second, the demographer in me can't help but ask about which parents are matched and which parents are not matched. So the matches here are based on co-residence. And I think it would be helpful We know that people whose parents are divorced or who were never married are more likely to live with their mothers. And we know that the propensity to live only with a mother varies across groups. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Black-white difference in the likelihood of living only with a mother. And I think it'd be helpful to think through how the inability to actually find someone's father may affect the extent to which you can estimate that intergenerational transmission. And I'll just say one more thing, which is on these intergenerational mobility implications. This is really important. And I think the contribution is potentially really big, and the empirical strategy here is very good. My only question is that the estimates of the intergenerational elasticity in the LHD are much, much smaller than elsewhere in the literature. And so understanding why that's so low, I think, is pretty important for understanding the extent to which the employer contributes to that estimate of mobility. Thank you. And thank you for everyone for being patient with my slides.
Thanks so much for those comments, Emily. And Lynn is up next. And we have already gotten one fabulous question in the Q&A. So please continue to have those questions roll in. All right, take it away, Lynn.
So thanks a lot. Thanks, Alex, for sharing, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'm going to be presenting on the signaling role of parental leave. And first, I'm going to start by motivating whether amenity take-up can actually be considered a negative signal. So in the case of parental leave, this may happen. Why is that? We see here in this picture, workers, when they become mothers, they may have changing priorities. We probably don't even need a picture to know this. And in fact, these changing priorities can even be larger than what these mothers predicted them to be. So there's this tension between firms and workers about which worker is which, and how can firms distribute the different jobs to different workers based on what they know about these workers. So the next question is whether there is some kind of status quo currently in parental leave taking choice, in the sense that whether career-driven women are actually those who are currently taking less leave, and does that matter? If we look here, this is a depiction of the childbirth penalty, which is the earning loss relative to the event of not having a child for different groups of women and as well as men. So the gray is men and the greens are different groups of women based on how long they take parental leave relative to other women in the same childbirth cohort in the same year under the same policy. And this is using data in Denmark. Obviously in the US, we don't have this much variation in parental leave taking, but this is not uncommon in other countries in Europe. So here you see that the childbirth penalty does differ a lot across women taking different amount of parental leave. This is not the case when you look at women before children, so you can't really tell who's who, but after they have children, it is pretty clear that the women who take the shortest amount of leave lose just about 20% in terms of earnings rather than 35%. And this persists over time. And this reflects both changes in wages, but as well as changes in hours. So they work, the one who, the career-driven women seem to work more hours, earn more. Now, is this because these career women are concerned about human capital depreciation? One suggestion from the literature is that no, that's not really what's going on here. It's not that, if you are career driven, you want to take less so that you have more human capital. When you look at policy extensions around the world, so as I said before, this is very common in Europe, that there are paid parental leave paid for by social insurance programs. In Austria and Germany, in Norway, you see these large extensions of paid leave. And in fact, when the maximum allowed leave duration is extended, you do see that mothers take longer leave. And there can be some positive consequences for children's later life outcomes, but there's definitely no negative impact on employment and wages beyond 3 years after childbirth. So these career-driven women, why is it that they're taking shorter leave? So the questions here that I'm bringing is whether mothers take shorter parental leave than they would have liked because of career pressure. And if the choice of parental leave length carries some stigma, do employers then kind of look at the distribution of leave and see, who's taking longer leave than others and who's taking shorter leave than others to decide how to set wages and distribute career and promotion opportunities? Obviously, the challenge here to answer this pair of questions is how do we tell the preference story from the career pressure story? Is it just that the career-driven women are those who just intrinsically want to take shorter leave, even if they're not worrying about human capital depreciation? Or is this that they're responding to some kind of pressure from the employers? So that's going to be the bulk of what this paper is going to bring to the table. How do we tell the story apart? But before that, I'm going to tell you briefly about my setting and data. Once again, I'm going to focus on the case of Denmark. It's actually quite a typical case, even if it sounds very unfamiliar to us in the United States. Denmark has had a very long history of federal paid parental leave, starting way back when, and this history here is only starting in the 1970s, but it's actually over 100 years of history. Parental leave has becoming more and more generous over time. Generally speaking, it started with 14 weeks for women, and today women in Denmark get about over 1 year of paid parental leave. And even though it sounds like a lot, it's actually only median among OECD countries. So this is a pretty typical case. When the leave becomes more generous, you see that fewer and fewer women are constrained at the maximum leave. I'm going to be focusing on, in the paper, 2 policies, but in the talk, mainly in the 80 policy, when we get an extension from about 3 months of maximum paid leave to about 5 months of maximum paid leave. And this is nice because women are going to be eligible for whether they can take longer or shorter leave depending on when they have their child, depending on the birthday cutoff. A little bit more about the broad setting over time in Denmark. As I said, when leave becomes more generous, women do take longer leave. But when leave becomes really, really generous, you see a broad distribution. Women start to diverge a lot in terms of how long or how short they take leave. So some women are starting to kind of leave money on the table, quote unquote, when leave becomes more generous. This is, however, not the case for fathers. So this scale is very, very different here. The maximum here is 20 days. And you see that even today, when fathers can share the majority of leave with mothers, they usually just take 14 days, which is the amount that is reserved for them. And when this was introduced in the 80s, fathers don't take any leave immediately. It took a few years for this to even catch on at all, or many years for this to even catch on. So I'm going to focus mainly on mothers here. So when is it that parental leave duration can carry a signal, or a negative signal with a longer parental leave duration? So the ingredients of my model is that workers need to have some kind of private characteristics that affect their cost of foregoing paid leave. So it's always costly to forego paid leave. You would rather stay home with your child, but this depends on some kind of characteristics that the firms don't know about, either how attached you are to work, how hard it is for you to not have to go home all the time and check in on your children, how good your support system is. So it may not be something about you intrinsically, but about your support system. Anything at all that may actually also affect your value to the employers. So employers may care about whether you're attached to work or not, whether you have a good support system or not, because then you can be more driven in your job. So the consequence of this would be, even if everyone likes to take leave, firms will start screening workers based on their choice of parental leave relative to what other workers are doing. And workers who have lower cost of foregoing paid leave will then have to just forego some in order to show that they are indeed those that are career driven. How do I bring this model to the data and kind of see whether this is really going on? So this is another depiction of the scenario that I'm talking about. So when leave becomes more generous exogenously to the women in my sample, I want to divide them into 3 different groups and ask what will happen to them as a consequence of this leave extension. So the 3 groups here, before the policy is extended, there's a maximum, say at 3 months. And there are women who would take maximum of 3 months. Now, leave becomes more generous. Only some of these 3 months women would then go on and take 5 months, when 5 months is the maximum. Some of the others, now the green ones, would then just take 4 months when 5 months is the maximum. Everyone is taking longer leave, but now the relative distribution has changed. And I call those who would take the maximum leave under both policies, the pre-pooler, the pooling before and the pooling after PP, those who take the maximum only under the pre-extension policy and not post, the pre-pooler but post non-pooler PN, and then everyone else who is never really constrained by the maximum and they never pooling before or after. So now
we're at 2 minutes.
The extension should have very differential impacts with these groups if you are able to separate yourself out from a large fraction of women taking the maximum, then you should have a positive wage impact as a consequence of this policy, even when you're taking longer leave in absolute terms. The opposite is for the people who are still pulling at the maximum. So do we see this in the data? So this shows that there is a policy in 1984 where there's an exogenous change in maximum leave for the women who have children around March of 1984. So you have children, a child a few weeks before you are randomly assigned to the less generous policy. And if you are randomly having children right after this policy, this cutoff date, you are under the more generous policy. And there's a sharp change just based on when it is that you have a child. And this policy was announced really quickly and implemented really quickly, so you don't really get to choose which side of the cutoff you are. So these women, on average, are very similar. So now what I look at is, if I just look at everyone all together, the extension doesn't really have any long-term impact on wages for everyone. But just like the prediction in the model, for those who are going from 3 months to 4 months, even though they're taking longer leave, now they're able to differentiate themselves out. And the consequence of the policy is that they have about 5% increase every year for 30 years. The opposite for the people who are still staying at the maximum, even though we don't see much going on before the extension itself. So those women were very similar before. The extension allows them to separate themselves out. The PN group now gain, even though they're taking more leave, because they're taking relatively less than the 77% of the population compared to what happened in the pre-extension world. And it doesn't happen for free. They now work in jobs with higher hours and so on. The small loss in wages is due to being lumped together with a smaller mass at the maximum duration rather than a bigger mass. So now you lump together with, you stand out more as taking the maximum.
And
So
we're at time, Lynn, but if you want to quickly wrap up, you should feel free.
Yeah, so I'm going to wrap up by saying that, I formalize when I'm meant to take up is associated with negative signal. And the important thing here I want to take away is the policy implication, meaning that you want to change the private cost so that the cost of foregoing leave should be the same for all women. Then you're going to break this channel. And you see that this channel does matter a lot in the long run for all women. And this explains why we see minimum mandatory leave post-childbirth. In many countries in Europe, you see women are asked to take at the minimum 3 months and so on. And this is also consistent with why men are not taking much leave so far. We see the status quo can stick because of this pressure from employers. And when the managers take more leave, this is going to be the policy channel that we can influence this channel. Then we can allow workers to take more leave as well. And so broadening it to today, if you have more normalized workplace flexibility, we're going to be able to allow women to take the leave that are meant for them.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And that is really fascinating to think about, especially in the policy context right now when more and more states are adopting paid leave social insurance programs, and also discussions happening at the federal level. And for another paper on a live topic about paid time away from work, I'm going to turn it over to Nicholas now.
I'm still muted, so can you hear me? I hope so.
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you see my slides?
We can see them and they are full screen.
Excellent. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. Thanks for inviting me. It's a great pleasure being here. This is work on mandated sick pay. So we talk about sick leave now, and we look at labor market effects. It's joint work with Catherine McLean at Temple and Stefan Pichler at ETH in Zurich. Thanks a lot for the Center for Equitable Growth to support us and fund our work. We really appreciate it. I try to stick to our 10 minutes and make it easy and hopefully accessible to everyone who's listening. So as you know, talking about the background, one main difference between Europe and the United States and also other countries in the United States is that we don't have universal access to paid sick leave in the United States. There are only two other OECD countries, I should add, that have similar non-universal coverage. Giving you some history, Ted Kennedy was the first person to introduce the Healthy Families Act to Congress in 2005. There was never a bipartisan consensus. We had other topics, as you know, like the Great Recession, the ACA. Now, for the first time, because of COVID and the public health effects, which I'm not going to talk about, we had a first bipartisan Family First Coronavirus Response Act passed in March that's going to expire at the end of the year. But historically, what we will be looking at is that a couple of, or dozens actually, of cities and states have passed sick pay mandates since 2007. So at the lower level, at the state level, at the city level, because there was no bipartisan consensus at the federal level, the regions have moved forward and passed these mandates. And we will look at the effects of these specifically state level mandates on a couple of labor market outcomes. So what we do in this work, and I should add it's an ongoing research agenda, is to use BLS firm level data from the National Compensation Survey. And on the next slide, I will talk a little bit more about the data set. And then we look at the state level mandate. So we technically use the state level variation and difference in differences models and event studies, which I will show you. And then the idea is to estimate the causal effects of implementing a mandate on first coverage rates. So meaning how effective are these mandates? Do more employees actually get access to paid sick leave? Then secondly, what we traditionally have called moral hazard in economics, but I don't think it's an appropriate term necessarily, but utilization effects. So we want to know, okay, given that workers are covered now and can take paid sick leave and unpaid sick leave as well in many cases, because there's for many workers not the possibility to take unpaid sick hours. So what are the utilization effects in the second step? And that could mean, we don't observe that, could mean that fewer people go to work sick. Could also mean, some people say that you have an increase in shirking. I will not really comment on this in this paper, but we look at the overall increase in utilization. And then finally, an argument of critics is that it's very costly and it may disrupt labor markets. So we have measures of sick leave costs per hour that we're going to look at. And then finally, also an argument by critics that, and also an argument you should consider, I think, as an economist, is that you may see crowd out of non-mandated benefits, right? So if the government forces firms to offer a certain benefit, could be that they scale back other benefits like parental leave, if not mandated, or vacation benefits. In the final part, I will not, given the 10 minutes and given the audience here, I will not really talk about the model that's in our paper, but we try to develop a model of optimal sick pay and have sufficient statistics and incorporate some empirical estimates into an optimality condition to say, well, is this policy likely welfare improving or not, or under what conditions would it be welfare improving? I can summarize it verbally, but I would like to focus on the empirical part to make it digestible. So talking about the institutional setting, what is a sick pay mandate in the first place? You may or may not know how they work. In the United States, they differ slightly, or actually a lot, in design from the versions in Europe. So in Europe, you mostly have designs that are similar to unemployment insurance. In the United States, what you have, at least in this version, there's also medical leave, which is for longer sickness and which is different. But these sick pay mandates that we are talking about make employees earn their sick time. So basically the law says, well, employees must have the possibility to earn earmarked sick time by working. So typically the laws say, well, you have to work 40 hours and then you get 1 hour of paid sick time on an individualized account. And so you can do the math. So you work a month full time, you get 4 hours, you work two months, you get 1 day. And then these times accumulate. You also have the right to take unpaid sick leave, and typically a 90-day wait period before you can take the sick time. The key is that this is personalized and unused day carryover. So it's your personal benefit. And the monitoring is pretty light. That's my observation or interpretation. For example, the difference to European laws is that employers explicitly are not allowed to ask for doctor's notes. So that's because of the healthcare access in this country, and you would discriminate. So the monitoring is pretty light. Dismissal protection, in my view, is light as well. So as a worker, you could call your employer and say, I have to take my paid sick day because, for example, I am sick or my child is sick. So you can take these sick days for sick children or family members. There are different ways to think about the benefit. You could think about it as an earmarked, budgeted time that's reserved for own sick leave or sick leave of family members. So, and most laws at the state level follow this basic principle. And the accrual rates are slightly different, but otherwise they are very similar. What we do is, so we use data from the BLS and we specifically the National Compensation Survey, and that is a government survey at the firm job level. So how this works is it's actually a very nice data set, also underutilized, maybe related to access. But each year in March, the BLS samples a representative set of firms and jobs, and then the HR department of the firm provides information for each type of job within that firm. And you have an extensive set of questions on fringe benefits and specifically the provision of paid sick leave and how much paid sick leave has been taken over the past year. The problem is a little bit that it's restricted access when you want to use the geo information and you need to travel to DC. And right now that because of the coronavirus, it's really difficult. And so, you know, that's one of the complexities here. What we do is relatively straightforward. So I don't want to talk too much about this model here. It's a relatively simple difference in difference model. So what you actually basically do is you look at firms that are in states that have implemented a sick pay mandate, and you compare your outcome variables for firms in those states over a certain time period to other control states that implemented the law later or earlier or have not implemented such a law. And then this
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Then I will skip the further discussion and jump right into this event study that you can produce. Here you see what you typically have when you have an event study, what you want to see, not much trending in the years before the law's implementation. And the outcome here is coverage. So this tells you how effective are the laws in covering workers. And you see a strong increase in coverage rates. They plateau after 2 years. You maybe will be talk about this maybe. This is the effect on paid sick hours taken. Again, you see what you would expect. So that's not nothing surprising here. You see an increase in utilization, in paid sick hours utilization. When we look at unpaid sick hours, you see a very interesting nonlinear effect that also makes sense. So first, when workers have to work and accumulate paid sick time, they can take unpaid sick days. So that goes up significantly. Then it goes back to the baseline when they can take paid sick hours. And finally, the other outcome we're looking at is sick leave costs. I jump right to a heterogeneity graph that I find really interesting. So this gives you a snapshot of the labor market in the United States. There's a lot of inequality. Here you see coverage rates. The dark circles are coverage rates by industry and occupation before the mandate. And you see some industries like accommodation and food services have coverage rates that are really low, below 30%. And then you see the gray circles here are the coverage rates after the mandates. You see the difference is the increase in the effectiveness. And you basically see that these laws and the mandates reduce inequality in the labor market in terms of access to paid sick leave. You also have occupations where coverage rates were really high already before, and you just have a mandate and a standard that reduces inequality. So just in time to wrap up, what we find to give you the point estimates is that the mandates are effective in increasing coverage rates, and we find by about 13 percentage points from a baseline of 66% on average. We also find an increase in the utilization and sick hours taken, but 1.8 hours. That is 14 hours per newly covered worker when you scale it by the 13 percentage points. So when workers gain access and get access to paid sick leave, they take about 2 days on average in the first year, or in the first 2 years, I should add. Sick leave costs also increase, but not by that much. So when you scale it and you look at newly covered firms, you would come to a number that's like 21 cents per newly covered firm when an hour worked. And we do not find, I didn't show you the results, but in the paper, we do not find much evidence for substitution effects and crowded effects. Our explanation is that marginal employers who are now forced to offer this benefit and did not offer it before the mandate are very unlikely to offer any other generous fringe benefits like paid vacation or family leave or medical leave. All right, that's it. I hope didn't take too much time. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. And we are running on time, so we can all feel good about it. And I will turn it over to Eric now for his comments. And with one more quick reminder, thanks for the questions that have already come in, and we would love more of your questions to be submitted to the audience. All right, thanks, Eric.
Is my screen showing?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming today, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to discuss these two really great papers. Just to draw some parallels like Emily did, I think these papers are, of course, they're very well done and they're very interesting, and maybe the common theme to think about with both of these papers is that we're learning a little bit about something about firm behavior here. A lot of times when we talk about social insurance programs that have to do with leave, a lot of times we focus on the workers themselves and any benefits they may receive from it. And the firm side of things gets a little bit obscured, but these papers have some aspects of them that critically deal with how firms may be responding and affected by government leave programs. And so I'm going to start with talking about Lynn's paper, and there is a lot there that Lynn covered in the 10 minutes, and I'll just do a little bit of a brief recap of what she did in this paper to sort of get into my comments and feedback on what we saw and what she's doing. So what did Lynn do? So she was looking at the signaling role of parental leave, and why is she studying this? So this is a figure that she went over in her presentation, but I'll just reemphasize that because I think it's really the starting point for having any comments about her paper. Is she's providing a new alternative explanation for the pattern that we are seeing in this figure. And so this figure on the y-axis is a measure of workers' outcomes, so it's their earnings, and then the x-axis is telling us something about time. And so what you're seeing here is that the workers' earnings, mothers in particular, their earnings are going down after they have their first birth, okay? And so as you can see in this figure, there's different groups and different lines here. And what you see is that the mothers who take relatively more leave are actually having larger earning declines relative to other mothers. And the often talked about interpretation of this figure is that we'll often say, oh, maybe something that's going on in this picture is that the women who spend more time outside the labor force are losing more human capital, and that's explaining what's going on in this picture. But what Lynn is doing is providing a new explanation for what we see in this picture, and that is that workers are actually just trying to resolve an imperfect information problem that firms have by providing a signal that tells their employer, hey, I'm a really productive worker, look at me, I'm going to take less time off from work, so firms reward that. And that's sort of the hypothesis that she's going to test here and in this paper. So again, what's at stake? There's two interpretations of this picture, either this human capital story or taking leave is some sort of signal out there. Why might this matter? Well, the signaling story suggests that leave may not directly affect the skills and productivity of workers. This is all about resolving imperfect information problems that firms have and firms have. And so what does Lynn find in the paper? Well, this paper and the empirical part of this is probably one of the most innovative and important things that's going on in this paper, is that she has a really compelling way to analyze whether signaling is going on by studying how this new policy change that happens in Denmark, how does it affect women and their labor market outcomes over time? And she focuses on a group of women who take relatively less leave just after this policy takes into effect, okay? And what she sees is that, in a nutshell, women who are taking this relatively less leave under this new leave policy actually have higher earnings and wages. And this is consistent with a model that's built up throughout the paper that is very consistent with this story about signaling, and she can provide a lot of different pieces of evidence and things to interpret this finding that makes this very consistent with the signaling story and not with the human capital story. Okay, and so the bulk of the evidence then, she's able to be fairly persuasive on saying that, okay, the evidence really suggests that what we're seeing is something about women and using leave duration as a signal in the labor market. And just so to broadly have a little bit of commentary on this is a great paper for economists in terms of looking at applied theory. We've got a model of signaling. Signaling is something that economists have studied a lot, but this paper does a really good job of having very compelling tests of signaling. And then, so I would not be surprised to see this paper in the future on people's graduate and PhD syllabuses as being an example of how to test signaling models, because the paper is really doing a tremendously good job with providing some compelling empirical evidence of what of the signaling model here. So suggestions for the paper, and so this paper is really well done. This was Lynn's job market paper, so I'm not going to have a ton of actual suggestions here. So much detail and care has been put into this paper that there's not much that I would actually add. And again, I'm just going to provide some suggestions that I think are just extra. I was reading a relatively old draft of this paper, and so maybe some of these things that Lynn's done subsequently since she wrote the original draft. But one of the things that I was thinking of while I was reading through the draft was, is there some value to looking at the results by industry? And the idea that I was thinking here is, well, there's potentially, in the signaling model, what's going on is there's all this asymmetric information problem between firms and workers. Firms don't know who their most productive or most valuable workers are, and they are relying on signals that that workers can provide to them with this information. One thing that you might get out of looking at heterogeneity by industry is some additional tests of whether this asymmetric information story is going on, because some industries may have more asymmetric information problems than others. So some industries, it may be the case that people are working in teams, which may obscure how much you can observe individuals' own contribution to productivity. There may be sometimes industries where it's just easier to fundamentally understand how productive different workers are and what their type is. And so by looking at some of this, some of the results by industry, you may actually get some stronger, some additional tests of whether or not asymmetric information is really what's driving this. And that's, again, consistent with the signaling story and not the human capital story, potentially. And then the other thing that I had in mind was just to think about whether or not there's any value to adding into the analysis, looking at workers switching between firms and workers' tenure with firms. Now, I don't know, I didn't have a very precise idea in mind with this. I was thinking that, you know, one thing that's going on is when you're with an existing employer and you make this signal that you're going to take not that much leave relative to other new mothers out there, that is very clear to your current employer, but how does that translate to a new employer who, you know, they're not obviously going to ask your past employer about the duration of your past leave events. And so I didn't know if some aspect of worker switching or worker tenure with firms would also help bolster and provide some more to the story of testing the signaling model here. And then finally—
and you're at just 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I know you have another paper to get to.
Okay, yes. Okay, well then I'll just say, sum up with, I hope that in the last 20 minutes, we'll have some more discussion of how Lynn sees her paper fitting in with current policy discussions. And so that will be the last thing I hope that we can get to in the last 20 minutes. Okay, so 2 minutes to talk about Nicholas's joint work with two other co-authors here. So this paper is also about leave policy, but it's about sick paid leave. This is a very well done piece. Nicholas has done several papers about paid sick leave in the US and in other contexts. And so this is continuing along a theme for him. One of the things that I would just like to hear more about, and maybe this is some things that we can talk about during the last 20 minutes of the session today, is to have more discussion of how this paper fits in with the broader literature about mandated paid sick leave. That's a suggestion for the paper, but also, again, for discussion in the last 20 minutes here. Specifically, one of the things that I took away from the paper is that, well, you didn't really talk that much about your prior work, Pilcher and Zebarth 2020, the JHR paper, but I think that there's actually, you're getting new evidence about paid sick leave, and you're getting it with different data looking at different outcomes, but you're also getting a more representative sample is maybe something that's going on. And that's one of the caveats that you had mentioned in your prior paper is that, you know, the representativeness of your prior paper was perhaps maybe had some limitations there. And in this paper, I thought that you're actually getting a more comprehensive analysis just because your data, the scope of your data, the geography of your data was actually much wider. And so having some more discussion in the paper about generalizability of the findings and sort of benchmarking a little bit to the Pilcher and Zebar paper, I thought would also be super helpful. And then the last thing I want to conclude on, I know that we're running out of time here, is again, in the last 20 minutes, I was hoping to hear more from you, Nicholas, about talking about how this paper fits into a lot of policy discussions. And one of the things that I had in mind is the estimates in this paper suggest that costs don't really increase that much, and they actually seem quite small. And so you mentioned this 21-cent number for marginal employers. And one way to think about this number of the 21 cents, you know, if I just look at your tables, it seems like this is a really, really small increase in cost for the employers. It's sort of 1% of mean hourly wages. So it seems really small. So if these costs are actually very small, it's a little bit, I want to know more about how you think about that, given the amount of pushback that we've seen in the political realm from different interest groups that have been trying to push laws that actually ban putting in paid sick leave as a mandatory policy. If costs are actually really low, what's really driving this that's going on? Is it actually something to do with heterogeneity? Maybe certain employers would actually have quite high costs of extending these policies, and so they're the ones who are really fighting for this. How do you think about the political economy of this issue, given the estimates of costs that you have in the paper? Okay, so hopefully I finished in good amount of time here. Thanks so much, Alex, and everyone else.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. You are right on time. And I'm now going to open it up for all of our panelists to spend 1 to 2 minutes responding to discussants if they would like. We'll go in the order that the papers were presented. We have a healthy number of questions that have come in, but we love more questions. So please send your questions along using the feature in Zoom. And I'm going to now turn it over to Paul, if you would like to make any brief remarks in response to your discussant.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Alex. Yeah, first I wanted to thank Emily for the comments. It's really nice. Yeah, I just wanted to touch on the 2 points that she raised. So the first point was, I didn't get the chance to show these results today, but I find that middle-aged workers that are in their 30s and early 40s are less affected than young adults in their 20s. And so that's a bit of a puzzle if you think of like a frictionless labor market where middle-aged workers are closer substitutes for older workers than younger workers. So I think my sense is that the main difference between young adults and middle-aged workers is that young adults are new entrants, whereas middle-aged workers are incumbents in those jobs. And so if you think that incumbents are more valuable to firms because they have accumulated from specific human capital or industry specific human capital, it might be preferable for firms to sort of adjust on the hiring margin of new workers. And that's sort of a little bit consistent with you know, the empirical regularity that younger workers are typically more affected than middle-aged workers during recessions, for example. So yeah, but I think that's something that's kind of an interesting find in the paper that maybe warrants a little more investigation. The second point that she raised was you could think that retirements could raise the demand for younger workers in specific sectors, for example, caregiving among retirees. So I think that would be an alternative explanation for why we find that in places where fewer people are retiring, maybe there's this increase in low-skilled jobs. Now, I think under that interpretation, you would sort of expect wages in low-skilled jobs to rise to make them more attractive to draw these workers, these younger workers in those occupations. But what I actually find is the opposite. I didn't show the wage results, but in places where fewer older workers retire, wages among young adults actually go down. And so that's more consistent with this notion that you have an increase in the labor supply, which sort of reduces wages for everyone. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Paul. And then I will turn it over to Matt if you want to respond to the discussant comments.
Sure. So yeah, thank you, Emily. And I should credit you because, what 2 or 3 years ago at the prior Equitable Growth Conference, we did talk about an earlier version of this paper. And in that version, kids working with their parents was kind of messing up my empirical strategy. And I think you gave me some encouragement to actually dig into that. And so I kind of ran with that suggestion. So thank you. So yeah, just a couple of responses to your very helpful points. So one, you raised a really good point that the estimates of the intergenerational elasticity and earnings in the LEHD are much lower. And so that's actually a really important point because it's entirely driven by my focus on like early career outcomes. So I show the paper is very, very long, but on page 100 of the appendix, I actually show that if you focus on later life earnings outcomes, the estimates of this elasticity are pretty similar to the literature. But that's an important difference between kind of my paper and some of the other ones on intergenerational mobility, this focus on early career outcomes. Second point, you note this good point about the kind of black-white gap that I find, and in terms of could differences in family structure be driving some of that? So this is a point that I need to push on a little bit more, but I can say a couple things about that. So one is that at least 50% of that gap is driven by employment differences in Black parents versus white parents, not differences in family structure. And to the extent that it is driven in family structure, I've done some analyses looking at parents who split up later in life, and have some evidence to show that these less stable families, individuals are less likely to work with their fathers in those cases. And so I don't think that the majority of that income gap is driven by kind of measurement error of me not being able to identify who the fathers are. And then one last point of, you brought up this point about could the results be driven by kind of unobserved heterogeneity, so like similarities between children and their parents. And so I think I have a couple of evidence to suggest that my kind of the estimates of the earnings consequences are not driven by that. One of the most compelling pieces there is I show that when you limit the analysis to comparing kind of siblings, you find pretty similar effects, and that should kind of partial out any of these differences that are common to kind of both parents and their children. But yeah, thank you for your comments.
Awesome, thank you, Matt. And now I'll turn it over to Lynn if you'd like to respond to Eric's comments.
Yeah, so thanks, Alex. Thanks a lot, Eric, for all the great feedback and comments, and also the very succinct summary of the paper. I was running out of time, but you did it in much better ways. So yeah, so the kind of if I were to pick one result, I would pick the same one, which is that even though some workers are taking in absolute terms longer leave after an extension, because after the extension, they're now able to take less leave than some other workers, then they gain in wages. So, and then you ask about the heterogeneity by industries and so on, and I think that's a great point. Some industries you would expect that workers have more incentives to signal. Say in industries with more wage variation, you see more career ladders to climb, and so you will see that workers have the incentive to make that push and show that they deserve that spot with the higher hours, but also the higher pay. And I do see this in the data, but one thing I do want to caution against this kind of interpretation is that the change in wages based on this policy change in absolute terms reflects two dimensions. One is how important it is, the signaling channel is, but two is how different it is before and after in terms of the relative distribution of leave. So say in some industries, like in law firms, you see a lot of workers already take less than the maximum. So then if leave becomes more generous, you don't really see much of a change because everyone is already revealing their type perfectly, right? Like at the extreme, that's gonna be the case. And so a leave extension will not really show much difference. It doesn't mean that it's not important. It only means that it's so important that even with such low level of maximum leave, people were already responding by taking less than the maximum. So the two things go on at the same time, and I do kind of see both, but it's very hard to say like the effect is indicative of the total importance. It's also about what people did before as well. In terms of policy implication, I was trying to touch on this at the end, but I was running out of time. So I totally agree, like you have the great point that I share, which I didn't write in the paper, which is that this explains why we see mandatory minimum paid leave in some countries. So these countries give women full pay to take like 6 months of leave. And yet they have to tell these women, you have to take at the minimum 3 months. Like you don't have a choice. This is in my, well, one way you can rationalize this. My story is not the only story, of course. One way is that, maybe people are worried that women don't care about the children as much as the government does. And you have to make sure that women stay home with the child to ensure that the child have, adequate care and so on. But I don't think that's probably not like the main story here. And my story will be that we are trying to avoid the race to the bottom. You don't want people to keep outdoing each other by taking less and less leave and unravel to the point that, for example, men currently don't take leave. And if that's the case, then, deviating from that and being the first one to do something different is going to look really bad. But at the same time, I'm not saying that that's the best, policy recommendation that we can have. If we look at the model, what is driving and causing this channel at all is the fact that people have different costs to foregoing leave. And so if we are providing all women, adequate ways to kind of take paid leave with low cost, then firms cannot base the decision to take leave and kind of say that that's the women with higher low cost of leave taking to infer who's the good or bad workers. So I would say that, these days with more people staying at home and work flexibility is more the norm, we should hopefully see a shift in the norm itself. Yes, so I agree with Nicholas that the official argument is the one that I said at the beginning, which is that to protect the children, but that's only if you think the mothers themselves don't care about their own children as much as the government does. So it is one explanation. I'm not saying it's not an explanation anymore. I'm saying I'm providing an additional one. Second is, if we change corporate culture, say if you ask the managers to be the ones to take leave first, then it's going to break the norm as well. You're not going to be associating shorter leave with higher ability workers any longer. So that's going to be the other channel or the other policy recommendation that I have.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And then Nicholas, if you want to take a second to respond to Eric's comments.
I take 2 seconds. Very briefly, thanks so much, Eric, for these excellent comments. Great points. Briefly, Stefan and I have a paper that just came out in JHR where we used the quarterly census of employment and wages and look at the argument of critics that these mandates are bad for labor market and wage growth. The difference to this paper is that in the other paper, we have average wages and employment at the city level or at the state level. And here we have the individual firm level data. We also look at wages, but it's a little noisy and we don't find much evidence that for any significant wage effects. The problem with these data, it's great data, but you don't really have information on background information of employees. So you don't see the characteristics of employees. You cannot really test if the employment composition changes by a lot, or at least on some margins, it's not doable. The second point you raised is also a great point. Why do states push back? So some states push back if the costs are so low. I mean, I guess my first point is the costs are pretty low, but these are like the official monetary costs. So some costs are not accounted for, which is admin or paperwork and also psychological costs. So one of my explanations is that some employers may actually that's more like a behavioral story, but may overestimate the actual cost to their business and the negative effect. So you always hear the argument, well, if we give that, employees get lazy and they take sick time, take off sick time. Just like in cities and states that implemented these mandates, and when you look at employer surveys, I have a much more positive attitude after they realized what these sick leave laws do to their business, or put differently, that they are not that traumatic in terms of the bottom line. So they typically respond, well, it's not a big deal. We make some adjustments here and there, but that is in line with what we think is going on. The other point, and then I stop, is I do believe, I don't have hard evidence for that, but some states push back, and it's mostly Republican states. I do believe there's a lot about political economy and strategic, pitching the argument to voters. And also, quite frankly, it's sometimes ideology. So, similar to the case for the ACA, when you really just oppose it for reasons that are motivated from a political perspective, in my opinion. But these are still important points. I mean, there are of course differences by industry. We shouldn't forget that. And there could be cases in industries where the costs are really high and there could be disruptions and businesses, firms going out of business. Okay, I stop here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicholas. So we have a few questions. I'm going to start out with two audience questions for Matt, and I'm going to stack them together. I think you may have addressed this to some extent in your response to Emily, but feel free to ignore or elaborate as you want. So the first question is, super interesting project. I'm wondering if Matt was able to examine differences by the parent's gender. Are these effects equally strong for mothers and fathers? Does gender concordance matter, which means mother-daughter and father-son pairs? And then the second question is for Matt. Can you say more about why you think you see a Black-white difference, especially in light of Emily's point about considering co-residence with parents?
Sure, thanks. So those are great questions. In terms of the first one, that is something I look at, and I look at that in two ways. So one, in terms of the likelihood of working for a parent. It's true that individuals are much more likely to work for a parent that's of the same sex. So there's gender concordance in that sense. Because fathers are more likely to be kind of stably employed, it turns out that sons are more likely to work for the employer of a parent relative to daughters. The second piece of that question is I also look at how these effects differ by, like, for the earnings consequences. And interestingly, I find that I basically find kind of very similar earnings benefits of working for the employer of a parent for all groups, regardless of whether you're working for a mother or father, with the one exception of when I look at daughters who go and work for their father's firm, the earnings benefits they gain from that are substantially larger than this like 31% figure that I mentioned in the paper. And then on the question of the Black-white gap, so I think I answered that a bit earlier, but I guess kind of elaborating on that point, I think those results are pretty interesting because, so I was going quickly, but one of the things that jumps out from those figures is that for daughters, the patterns of the intergenerational transmission of employers look very similar across the parental earnings distribution, whereas for sons, all the race ethnicity categories look pretty similar, except for Black sons, where Black sons are much less likely to work for the employer of a parent relative to other sons in the same parental earnings category. And so that's an interesting finding in light of some recent work from Chetty and co-authors who found kind of a similar finding for income in the US. So conditional on parental income, daughters from different race ethnicity categories appear to have pretty similar earnings. Whereas for sons, Black males seem to earn substantially less than their counterparts. And so one thing I show in the paper is that this gap in the intergenerational transmission of employers, this Black-white gap, explains about 10% of the earnings gap you see between these groups.
Thanks so much for that, Matt. And I think we have time for one more question. And this is one that Emily has for Nicholas. I'm going to read it. And then Emily, if you want to elaborate, feel free. No. Okay, I'm just reading it. So the question is there any evidence that mandated sick leave reduces benefits for firms that already offered it prior to the mandate?
That is a great question. So we have a long to-do list of stuff that we want to do. Some of the points Eric mentioned, and that is also on. So you mean if there are spillover effects, basically, right? That's one of the points on our to-do list to examine what does this do to firms that already offered benefits. And one element we looked at is the type of sick pay firms offer, and it seems to be the case that there's not much substitution or crowding out in the sense that new firms set up specific sick pay accounts, but we haven't looked at the impact of firms that previously offered sick pay and how they adjusted specifically. So we will have to do that. But that's a great point. Thanks.
Excellent. So I think we are running to time. Did any of the panelists have any last pieces of wisdom or thoughts for each other that you want to sneak in this last minute? Okay.
This is not a thought of wisdom, but I just want to add one clarification because I see a question from Nicholas. In my case, parental leave is paid by the government, not the firm. So the firms don't really have any cost here. So that's not going to be a factor.
Awesome. Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for a really robust and interesting set of papers, a really intellectually stimulating discussion. Thanks especially to our discussants who drew some really nice threads between the papers, and to the audience for listening in. It's been a real treat to get to engage with all of you. And I look forward to seeing everyone tomorrow for the last day of EG 2021 conference.